it's funny where I would say if you heard us talking about shoving the river over a bet and it sounded fantastic to you, you probably shouldn't do it because you're probably going to be identified as the guy who would do it. And if it sounded suicidal to you and you're saying, I would never do that, that's crazy, you're probably the guy that this is going to work for and everyone's going to fold if you do it. So,
What's up, guys? I'm here with Jonathan Jaffe. He's won over 12.8 million in Hendon mobs, and he's crushing the Triton poker scene. And on top of that, he's spreading the word about poker and here to teach you guys as well with his company, being part of the company GTO Lab. Is doing a lot of things, in fact, and he's writing a book about poker too. Is that right, Jonathan?
yeah, I haven't done as much writing as I would like to this year. The writing part is proving more difficult than the research, but that's the plan.
Really? Okay, that's interesting. Well, I'd like to talk about that. I also am writing a book, by the way, but a bit of a different approach. We'll see. So tell me, it seems like you did like a lot of different things in poker, and then you settled on Tritons, and that was really a big part of your focus in poker as of for a while. I read for a couple of years now. Do I have that right? And can you tell me is there something specific about the Tritons that you like so much?
Yeah, I kind of felt a crossroads might be overstating it, but a couple of years ago, I wasn't exactly sure what my place was in poker. I was playing a private game in Florida that was really good up until COVID. Stopped playing during COVID, and that was a period where the online games were really soft, and a lot of players got a lot better because you're locked in and there's not much to do. But that's when I started coaching a lot, which in some senses made me a better player in some ways, but I wasn't playing online. And so I kind of fell behind some players that I thought maybe I was ahead of up until that point. And, between that and playing in a private game, my game wasn't really getting sharper for the most part. And I think ego wise, I wasn't too happy with my new place in the poker world and maybe not too ready to accept that, whatever level I was at had fallen a little bit because of people who had risen past me. And with a reluctance to get into solvers in any kind of meaningful way, that trajectory was looking pretty bad for me for a while. And so I was kind of thinking about my next step. And I wasn't exactly forced into a decision because I still had coaching and good coaching business that I enjoyed. But Nick Petrangelo is a good friend of mine, and he had a very different trajectory from me, where he always wanted to play in the toughest games and be one of the best tournament players in the world. And he did that. But along the way, he was kind of always, poking at me like, come play, get better at poker, work on the things you need to work on, sharpen your technical skills. I don't know about belong here, but you have a place here. It won't take you much to get to this level. You can be here and it won't take all that much work just sharpening up technical skills. Like look at a pre-flop chart or two, get a little better with some basic stuff that's more in the realm of memorization as opposed to necessarily theory.
I would think tough games would take more than that to beat, but what do I know? Um, I don't know
Yeah,
what games he's referring to.
yeah, he was talking about the biggest buy-in tournaments, which it's interesting because it doesn't mean you're going to be a top 10 player, but because the buy-ins are so big, you don't need to have a very high ROI to be finding yourself with a pretty good hourly, even if you're selling. So I think that was his pitch, was not that it was going to take me less than, let's say, 100 hours of work to be a top 10 player in the world, but that it wouldn't take all that much work for me to be profiting in those games. And I don't think that's Nick's opinion, just generally speaking, of anyone who's been playing for a while. He kind of knows my process and my poker brain intimately. And that was his opinion based on, the time we've spent together talking strategy.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I guess it can make sense. I guess the Tritons are soft enough where there's quite a few players that can be profitable in them. I wasn't I played them a decent amount. It seemed like they kept getting better and better for a while. At least we know when they included Vietnam and all these other crazy places. Well, maybe not so crazy like Korea and places like that. Um, yeah, I mean, I could see someone. I guess it's possible to make put a focus on those specifically. I don't know if that's really a way of becoming a pro. I do always advocate actually for the people who are trying to make money to find like where to focus on to make the money and then just like own in on that. So, I mean, yeah, I guess Tritons could be the thing. I like the Tritons quite a bit, even though I don't play them that much. But I have other things I have to do. So, I guess it's an
Yeah.
option for many people from the who are like trying to make like real money from poker and have succeeded at like mid stakes or whatever. I guess that's like a potential route for people to go. Or what do you think?
I think Triton specifically, when you talk about how you decide you want to spend your time, it's not just an equity calculation, I think, for both of us. And the thing about Triton is I just have so much fun there. They treat you so well. You're not overloaded. I think one of the things about the tournament series that has the different tournament series that exist that's kind of kept me from being a guy who would travel around for a full year is the big crowds. I just don't like being around a ton of people at once. I find it kind of socially taxing. I'm
Mm-hmm.
someone who likes to talk at the table, but away from the table, I really like to be alone and have my headphones in. I don't want to talk hands in between 2 hour periods on that 15-minute break. And when you're at World Series, which don't get me wrong, I'll be out there and I'm going to play, a cluster of tournaments. But I find it very taxing walking in those long hallways and recognizing 50 people that you feel compelled to head nod to or fist bump, or maybe if it's been a while and you were close with them once, stop and, have a little bit of a catch up. All of those interactions I would enjoy in isolation, but when they compound and you've just got dozens and dozens of these day after day, it kind of takes something that's really nice, socializing with old friends or acquaintances, and turns it into a really taxing chore. And Triton just doesn't have that. You run into like 3 dozen people who all kind of understand the same thing, and I just find it so much. Um, I don't know if comforting is the word. Just it's much more relaxing mentally for me.
I will say the Triton tournaments. Shout out to Triton; they're one of the best run tournaments that are around. So there is that, and yeah, I guess you don't. Yeah, you deal with a smaller crowd that maybe you know a little bit better. So that's a plus too. Personally, when I go to Vegas, I'm actually like a crazy introvert. I just work and I like can tune out the crowds, which is a weird surprise for me. And I mean, I don't mind to do media promotion, all that shit. But I wonder if it'd be interesting to see how the poker players respond in general to the whole craziness of Las Vegas, or rather the tournaments. Just because I suspect that a lot of the poker players are introverts, but I can't prove it. That being said, there are some personality tests that some back. Well, there's one backing group in general that I know uses like some personality tests to test like which players are good for poker, and I wondered if like maybe introversion is one of those key those traits.
Mhm. Yeah. I think, what you said at the top of that is something I need to get better at is tuning out the crowd. I It's been a lifelong struggle. It is what it is. I'd like to get better at it, but I have this one thing. I don't want to overstate this because I've seen people who have a much more pronounced version of this, but I don't recognize faces very well, which is a strange thing as a poker player. But when you're walking on these like long hallways and you see people's eye contact, basically, if somebody anyone who wants, you can kind of prank me if you just kind of look in my eyes for like over 2 seconds, I'm going to head nod or maybe fist bump like we know each other because I'm not sure. And I think there's a good chance that I could know you decently well. It's really embarrassing. And so I just kind of err on the side of caution and try to, affirm whatever social interaction comes my way, out of fear that it's going to be someone that I'm relatively close with. And I don't want to accidentally big dog them, which can be, tragic.
Um, this I know a tiny amount about. I know that there's an actual condition for not being able to recognize faces very well,
Yeah, I
and
can't
there's
claim
also
that.
people who
They
are
have it much worse. Yeah.
yeah. There's also there are people that are really good at recognizes faces too, and probably it's very trainable to fix if you really care to fix it. I'm sure you can find a way. So there's that. I will say that I've had it plenty of times where someone will they say they know me and I just don't remember who they are. So it's like who knows?
Yeah.
Like I feel like it's normal in the poker world. Not exactly social savants going around in poker is my personal guess, but no,
Mhm.
I feel like I've seen not that many more awkward groups. Um, So, is your main income from Triton, or is it from? Would you say it's? Do you make a significant portion from coaching as well, or like something else?
It's really shifted all throughout my career. I started off as a heads up sit and go player. When I was 18, that was my income for, let's say, 6 years. But I also binked second in a WPT when I was 21. So that was a big influx.
Yeah, I read about that. Congrats, 21, second WPT, not pretty decent.
Yeah, yeah, that was a real shot in the arm right away. Maybe not right away. I'd been professional for 3 years, but it was the beginning of playing live tournaments for me. Uh,
Hmm.
I recognized right away that I wasn't the guy who wanted to travel around and play all the WPTs. As much fun as they were, I didn't want to put the time into going to all these different places, and it's kind of a homebody. And then, but it did give me some room to back other players, which, naturally backing players and having an investment in them, you want them to play better. So I began coaching as well. And I would say around Black Friday, the games got a lot tougher, and I started to again drop in terms of status for where I was in the heads up world. And that was mainly due to HUDs and a change in the structure. We went from non-turbo heads up sit and goes to turbo sit and goes to hyper turbos, which really emphasized a different skill set. And as someone who didn't collect data, I just typed my own notes, which was no longer sufficient when you're talking about a game that's heavily pre-flop. And I watched myself just get worse and worse and didn't love it. And my love for the game, not coincidentally, began to wane. But I still wanted to make money in poker and still identified as a poker something. And so backing and some degree of coaching was my main income for a while there. And then I moved to Florida, and it was just pure luck that I fell into a really good private game. That was my income for a few years, primarily with some coaching on the side. And then, yeah, when COVID hit, coaching really dialed up for me in a bigger way. And if I were to say, like, equity wise, I would guess that live tournaments and coaching are probably about equal, if I had to like guesstimate. But of course, live tournaments are so variable. I could, lose 1.5 on the year. That would be a very reasonable, run out, or make 3 mil or whatever. Whereas the coaching is a more steady income. But I think the equities are relatively similar.
Okay, that's a fair point. Yeah, I mean, if you get proficient enough, you can make decent money from coaching. Uh, it's no secret. I was curious though, just because I also a big topic that I personally like to talk about is a certain version of game selection, more like game choice, you can say, or like going into looking for the right kinds of markets of games. But that can also, I mean, on that kind of topic, can be okay. Maybe there's some other way to make money for other players. So what I mean by that is, if you find like a pool of soft games on an online site that is a lot softer than another pool for whatever reason, it makes a lot of sense to focus on that pool, and that can like make big differences to players' bottom lines and things like that. Uh, and I found that focusing on stuff like that, especially when you like consider all your live options and even like coaching options, what can really show where one can make money, because poker, it can be very volatile, of course. So it was interesting to see like how your way of making money shifted a lot, and you kept adapting based off of like whatever your personal skill set was and how people were playing in those games. Like apparently hypercent goes were no longer good um, after a certain amount of time. And yeah, it was just interesting to see how variable your way of changing and then ending up in Triton's was. Yeah, so congrats on being a bit of an example in that department, just because I've done a bit of that myself. I shifted a lot based off of where I could personally make money in my career. And that was one of the big reasons why I like ended up making money, was I just kept looking for many different like pockets of value, and I got a bit lucky in a lot of spots too. Good job selecting games and finding where the value's at.
I think some of it, something that's not ancillary to hunting down the best EV, is just following what you actually enjoy, which may be making a third as much money doing something completely outside of poker. And I know that personally, I need to do something different. I cannot imagine that I will ever have a 10-year period again where I'm doing the same thing. I think heads up, sit and goes is about as long as I'll ever remain in one area. And even that, I was
Mm-hmm.
playing tournaments on the side and coaching as well. So to say I was just playing heads up, sit and goes would not be accurate. But some of this positive EV hunt, like for instance, the private game in Florida, it was pure luck. I didn't really put work into hunting down my best hourly. It fell in my lap. I could see myself have gone down, going down many different routes. At the time, I was really just trying to get good at golf, and it had nothing to do with making money. It was just a hobby. And I looked on Bravo and found a 25-50 game. I showed up, it was 25-51. I played pretty crazy, and they said, "We love you. Keep playing with us," and that ended up being good. So I don't want to take too much credit, because I do have some friends in poker who I think are phenomenal at this. That they have just adapted year after year, followed the strategies that you need to do to make money in this new, this new era, and they've moved from this app game to that live game, or they've gone and grinded in Macau for long periods. Like that was something that I think was told to me multiple times that would be a good place for me to make money. And I just realized, regardless, I probably need to be paid like 6 times whatever my real at home hourly looked like to do it based on the lifestyle that I heard. So, I think that one thing, because poker players, we all speak the same language around EV. Like, there's no online tournament player who plays Wednesdays and Thursdays but skips Sunday. Like, that's not really a thing because you follow the EV. But I think what can get lost in that sometimes is following what you actually enjoy doing. And, for example, I think there are probably some players who are stuck in a private game atmosphere because they make so much money at it, but they just can't walk away from that hourly, even though maybe they would have a lot more fun making a fraction of that as an online tournament player or somebody traveling the WPT circuit or something.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, it's really kind of dependent on the person a lot, and yeah, it'd be interesting to. There might be some kind of way to map out enjoyment versus money being made. Yeah, I totally. I'm with you with this Macau stuff. I've done the Macau grind a bit, 30-hour sessions and stuff like that. Then I calculated the money. I was like, you know what? Maybe this is worth it. Uh,
Yeah.
and yeah, I make decisions a bit like that as well. The Tritons are high on the enjoyment list. Are you referring especially to the Tritons or to something else? Is there's okay, okay, just
I
making sure.
wasn't thinking of Triton when I was on that little rant, but I Triton really checks that box for me where the equity can continue to go down and I'll keep showing up for quite some time, just because of all of these secondary things like just playing tennis with a lot of friends every day, seeing people that I really enjoy. It just has like all these positive summer camp vibes that I really dig. And, a couple times a year, it just feels like the vacation. Like, I'm not a guy who really likes vacation. And Triton, this might be sacrilege to some of the guys who work a lot harder than me, but for me, it's like vacation. Even when I'm whiffing, it sucks. It's not fun to lose, but it's my favorite kind of poker. I love that you have the app. And so, like, being on your phone at the table is actually really plus EV, like trying to track all the hands that different players you're not familiar with are playing. One of my negatives with playing live poker is I just feel like it's not stimulating enough most of the time. There's not really productive things that you can do with your brain. They're productive things, but I don't find that the cost benefit is enough where I want to really focus on every hand, especially reg versus reg hands between two people I know.
Well,
And so I
you're
get kind of
you're one of the
bored.
few people. You're one of the few people that kind of agree with me. I get so much shit for not focusing playing live. I don't personally think it's worth the. It's actually a good topic. Really, it's almost not good that you agree with me, just because I'm in this personal boat where I just don't think that focusing every hand really matters that much unless you're one of these kinds of people that if you don't focus on something, you're gonna now not be able to adjust when it's really hard for you to shift tasks or something like that. I could see that, but I don't think that you really gain enough EV by looking at opponents and things like that, watching the hands and stuff like that, or like
I
paying attention to their.
Yeah. There's diminishing returns. So if you're entering, the NFL, the importance of studying film for a rookie is just very different from a 10-year veteran. The 10-year veteran should still put some work in, but the rookie has so much more to pick up. So people who are new to playing live tournaments, if they can, manage it, yeah, they should pay attention to everything and try to acquire some experience in terms of understanding, connecting different variables that are a little more second nature to someone who's been doing it for 10, 20 years.
That's a good point. Um, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, also it'll be a bit more interesting for them too, because it's
Yeah.
not so interesting personally when I'm playing. It's a little bit slow in comparison to the 4+ tables online or whatever it is. I do think it's really important in certain situations to watch people's emotional states, and sometimes certain hands can have massive effects on the way people play the next few hands. But you don't really need to know too much detail to capture these sorts of emotional shifts. And it's more specifically true in like cash game environments and I don't. It's sometimes true in tournaments. The psychology of what happens in hands, I think, can matter a lot in tournaments, just because that is something that can be very, very difficult um, to become stoic about. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you do your best to quantify these things and the emotional state. If you're talking about a high stakes cash game, especially some of the private games, there are guys who are completely locked up after they're up a significant amount of big blinds, and other guys who might go even crazier once they're up 600 big blinds. And so, knowing that about an opponent, watching their emotional state, tracking how they respond to wins, losses, a bluff shown their way is hugely important. It's not to say that it doesn't exist in tournaments. I think you want to spend more of your bandwidth focusing on the players you don't know, and especially the ones that you don't think are professionals, because there's a greater spectrum or a wider spectrum of possibilities from those players than from a seasoned pro. But again, quantifying it, it's not to say that focusing isn't going to be beneficial. It's how much benefit is there. So if you're talking about, say, a 10K at the Poker Go studio and you think you have a 14 ROI and you think that tuning out and listening to music and taking care of emails on your phone brings you from 14 to 9, then okay, you have lost $500 in this, guesstimated equation over the course of X number of hours, and you decide what that means to you.
That's a good way of putting it. I don't know how to actually estimate it. I don't know that it really costs $500. I'm thinking like, if are we comparing focusing every single hand and on what every single player is doing versus like being on your phone and like not doing all of that? Are we comparing those two things?
I think so, but it also is player to player. If you take someone like a Chance Corneth is very sensitive to the vibe, and he's willing to adjust in a much greater manner than a lot of other players. So it's probably more important that he really focuses. Whereas someone who is not going to adjust as much, the focus is not going to bring the same returns for them. So I think there's that. But I think even if the numbers are very big, like say 14 to 9 is a very reasonable guesstimate for a player, there's an unseen cost, which is whenever you focus really hard for a long number of hours, that's costing you on the back end in one way or another. It's tends to be a little bit draining. And then if you go home and you have a family or anyone that you're hanging out with, you might be more drained, and you're going to give everyone and everything else in your life a little bit less. I think when you can take care of errands on your phone, as I sometimes do when I'm playing in a lower buy-in tournament, and take care of, like catching up on socializing or whatever it is that, might need to be checked off, you have a little bit more to give to the other things in your life later on.
Yeah, that's a fair point. There's often lots of hidden costs to a lot of different things. People don't assess things in a a truly uh, what's the word? The full picture kind of way would be the way of looking at it. There is what you're referring to is that willpower does have a limit to it. There's this idea that willpower just is like a battery or something that doesn't have an infinite like it's like something that has just finite storage to it, and the more you exhaust it, the more you use it, the more you have to get it from, the more you have to recharge it or whatever it is. Um, Actually, one situation that people don't think about in poker is when you get into a lot of these like private games, etc. They often don't think about the adding. It's on the topic of a full of like not looking things at the full picture, but the topic of like not getting paid, that being some kind of percent, and not factor that in overall to the bottom line and that sort of thing. Yeah, getting cheated as well. I find getting cheated is a little bit easier to predict, but not getting paid, especially in these kinds of things, like no one ever really considers how those things affect the bottom line. But it is nice that in tournaments you always get paid. So then the usual model that people have to look at whether to look at what their ROI is actually works really well for tournaments, but doesn't always work really well for live cash games. So I thought I'd throw that out there just because it's really easy to forget these kinds of details when looking at like how profitable or not profitable something is.
Yeah, yeah, there are outliers that add up. I can remember back in the day, somebody I was backing had a good opportunity to play a private underground game in New York City. And one of the questions I asked him is, what percent do you think it gets robbed? Not because that simply being a number means you can't play, but let's count that into our, equation of how much money are you making? Because if the margins are really small and we think that you're 2% to not get paid, and 1% that this is a setup and you're going to get robbed, and another 1 in 1,000 that you might get harmed, this is starting to not look so good, even if it was, let's say, predicted to be 4x your normal hourly.
Yeah, it's a weird situation. Not sure how much
Yes.
money is it that it costs you to risk getting robbed?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I grew up playing in a game where I was 17 and we had a security guard at the door who he was armed and they were, I didn't even
Whoa.
drink and people are doing lines at the table. It was when we were basically in a fell off the truck store where it was like after you're getting paid out and I'd be like, they're paying me out 8,500 in winnings. I'm all excited and they're like, hey, do you want a speaker? Do you want a gold necklace? Like, basically you can give back like 2 grand and I've got all sorts of goodies for you. And I'm just like looking around this like small warehouse, like, I think I'm good as long as I can leave here safely, which always good.
That's one way to get paid, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, it reminds me of a story that vaguely reminds me of a story where Ben Lamb was playing in a game and he shows up with a watch. Do you ever hear about this story? I don't know if you
Mm-mm.
know these guys that much, but he shows up with a watch and the guy like offers to buy his watch for like some kind of ridiculous price, and Ben's like, "All right, sure, I'll sell this watch to you." And then apparently Ben comes in with another watch, and the guy just like offers to buy that watch too. Um, and then like soon enough, like Ben keeps playing this game, and he keeps wearing watches to this game because he knows that this guy is going to offer money to pay extra on top to buy his watches.
Unreal.
I want to talk about some of the most important hands that you've played in your career that really stood out that you've been really proud of, or that helped you learn something that changed your just the way things were going for you. Do you have any of those?
Um, okay. Yeah. I haven't ever thought in that context, but one just jumped to mind right away, which was, I want to say it was either a 2K or a 5K heads up sit and go. And the opponent was mostly a high stakes cash player. I believe he was a pro. His name was Red Dog something. I don't know if that rings any bells for you. Red Dog and some numbers.
Um,
Any bells?
sure, sure. Sounds like a great player.
So he was beasting me, and I was getting pretty frustrated because the move that was beasting me, and it sounds so funny and basic now. I'm gonna guess this is 2009, but I'm not sure. Is I'm betting the river, sometimes bluffing, sometimes value, and he just keeps shoving over me. And I folded to like 6 of these over the course of like 3 games, and I'm just like, this guy just keeps hitting. And then it's like I make a very light value bet at some point with nines on a board that had at least a king and a queen on it, maybe it might have even been dicier than that, but it was the bottom of my value range pretty much. And I bet like, let's say, half pot out of position in like a check down pot, I want to say. And
Hmm.
he just rips it, and it was a brick river. And I was like, I'm fed up. And I don't think it was, I can't remember how much like logic went into my call in terms of like, this guy can't just keep having it in this weird manner versus just tilt. And I was just like, this, I'm done. But I click call and he ends up with a bluff. And my mind just blew up. And I'm like, oh God, he's been just crushing me. This guy was not hitting. And clearly there's something to this move because I'm a very aggressive player. I'm not doing this and I'm falling for it. And that probably was the beginning of some just outrageous period where I just kept shoving the river over every bet I saw for some period of time, which no doubt made far more money than it should have. But that's what jumps to mind first when you talk about kind of landmark hands where I learned something. It wasn't very sophisticated, but I think it was a paradigm shift for me to kind of recognize that, like, it doesn't really matter if you don't make too much sense if the opponent is not going to think through it logically. And people are just stuck in a certain way of thinking until their eyes have been opened, as I was at that moment.
Well, practicality over theory for sure. I'm in that boat. If it works, why change it? Why does it have to make perfect sense according to some genius? All right. So I guess guys. I mean, try the raise all in on the river for the audience. I was
I
not
would say
expecting that
it
from
all
you at all.
Yeah, it depends
Huh?
what stage of development you're at. So you can extrapolate outside of poker to advertising in the developing world is going to look a lot more similar to the advertisements we had probably in like the 20s and 30s, like much more basic campaigns that, everything kind of develops in similar manner. And where we were in poker, even heads up poker in, let's say, 2009 was just such a basic way of thinking that if that bluff didn't exist for the most part and most people just weren't taking it, then you were just projecting, what does my range look like here? Looks like I river to set. Okay, guess you river to set, fold.
Um, I do think. I mean, I had a lot of evolutions when I was playing. I do think that it depends a lot on people's perception of you as well when you are applying these kinds of things. I could see this, even like these kinds of over aggressive lines, going very well for a decent amount of people, just because. I mean, most players just don't. There's quite a few players that don't really have these kinds of like aren't like going in this absurd kind of directions. This is absurd for a reason. I don't know if it'd really be great for maybe the theme of doing this in general. Maybe not the river overret shove necessarily, but the theme of having an over aggressive period probably is overall beneficial for probably the majority of players, I would guess. Um, It sounds like you had that period. It sounds like on the whole you were over aggressive, or was it just the shove river play?
I was very aggressive, and I think that helped me stumble on some good stuff. That was just a temporary period. I don't know how long I was using that play myself. But what you were saying, as far as like how a viewer, could maybe use this, it's funny where I would say if you heard us talking about shoving the river over a bet and it sounded fantastic to you, you probably shouldn't do it because you're probably going to be identified as the guy who would do it. And if it sounded suicidal to you and you're saying, I would never do that, that's crazy, you're probably the guy that this is going to work for and everyone's going to fold if you do it. So there's something to the person who's doing it in terms of how effective it'll be. Like, it's not going to be effective for you or I in a WSOP tournament. People are going to snap us so light they can imagine every bluff being possible.
um, yeah, I guess that's a very fair point. That's probably true. I still suspect like it won't have such high efficiency. Fortunately for all the crazy players out there, they can still give it a shot and maybe it'll work. We
I
had a
think I
guy
don't
on
know how
here.
much you've Yeah, I don't know how much experience you've had with this, but I think one of the most fun things about coaching is individualizing like the last minute plans for someone where you say, okay, we're working on theory, we're sharpening your technical skills, but now you're going and you're playing a 3K WSOP event, and I want you to recognize that everyone's just going to peg you as a complete nit. So here's a couple of exploits that should work very well for you. That can be really fun. Like, creating a battle plan that I can't enact myself, but that certain players can, at least for a short period of time.
I've tried to do that, but I've had limited success with that just because it turns out that people don't like listen as much as you would. The words of logic, the words don't like translate 100% very well to a lot of people. It's very hard for like them to bypass a lot of emotions and like do. I mean, there's some validity to it, but I just find people don't do things. There's just I'm trying to think of a really good way to say it. It's like if someone was to read something in a book and even if it's a good idea, they're not going to put it into their life almost ever just because there's so many emotional barriers going on.
Sure.
It's the same thing with a poker plan. You give someone a poker plan, you say like, "Hey, listen, like everyone thinks you're it. Just run any bluff at all. If you bluff like there's plenty of people that if they just bluffed like I say this all the time. They just bluff randomly. It would be plus EV, but then they still don't do it, and it's
I like
uh,
that challenge. I kind of view it I think one of my strengths in coaching anyway is recognizing who you can tell something to and they're going to just enact it relatively quickly. I think they wear it on their personality. The people who are just like, great, that's logical. And this guy is an expert and he told me, I'll do it. They tend to be the minority, especially among recreationals. But the majority of players, you do have to build that emotional bridge for them. You have to get them from there to here. You can't just say, look, this is good. They'll agree with you and they'll even think that they're going to enact it. But when push comes to shove and they find themselves in that moment, their knit instinct or lag instinct is going to kick in and they're going to kind of do what they want and follow their feeling. So for those players, I think I'm good at recognizing after I've told them this is a great combo to bluff. You really want to push, even though it looks like no equity on the turn, it ends up being a great follow through on the river. And they say, great, great, I'll do that. And I said, I don't think you will. So we're going to spend the next 10 minutes where I'm going to try and really sell you on it emotionally and try and play out these different hurdles that you're going to encounter in the moment and why I think you're going to talk yourself out of it. And I want you to picture me, with the pitchfork and devil tail on your shoulder being like, go for it. You got to do it.
Is that what you actually say? Is that what you
A
actually
fair amount
say?
of that. I don't think the devil pitchfork, but I think the imagery is hopefully there for them.
So, how do you? What are some ways that you emotionally coach them into doing it?
I think you have to attempt to recreate it or create it ahead of time. You say, all right, so here's the scenario. I'll give you an example where this actually doesn't have to do with pulling the trigger or not. This is having to do with a friend of mine who didn't have the best work ethic. And when push came to shove, I think he was always going to do a little bit less work than he believed. So once I remember him going on a trip to Borgata for a tournament, and he told me, while I'm there, I'm going to put in at least 50 hours of cash. And I was dubious that that was really going to happen. So I said, I believe that'll happen if prime circumstances play out, but try to play out a world where you get eighth in the tournament. Are you really going to bust eighth in the main event and then just, saunter over to 510 and put in these hours? Probably not. What about if you bubble? Essentially, playing out all these different, very reasonable scenarios and seeing how do you think you're going to feel in that moment? Are you actually going to do that? So, if we translate that instead to, what we were really talking about, which is pulling the trigger. Let's say for a player who's a nit, not making the bluff. I say, let's try to imagine it's the end of day one. They've announced there's 4 hands left in the day, and you have 6 times starting stack, and you're really pumped. You want to bag your 6x starting stack, go to day two, text the family, like, had a great day one, day two's tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. Play it out, try and, I'm not sitting here, saying close your eyes and doing a 20-minute imagery session, but doing my best to describe it in a minute or two and saying, you're going to look down at this spot. You're going to say, this is what Jonathan said. I'm supposed to overbet the turn with this combo that I have never conceived of overbetting before. But I have been proven, by whatever solver output that it's a really good bet. And I do trust Jonathan, sort of. But now I just really don't want to end up with 2x starting stack. I don't want to, I don't want to bust and have to play day one again or whatever it is. And so trying to, climb over those hurdles before you find yourself in that spot. That way you feel like you've been there before and that these are not extenuating circumstances that help you talk yourself out of doing that thing that, because you'll always find excuses, I think. So trying to play out some of these extreme cases, I think helps you feel like you've been there before. Because that's what pros do, is they've been there again and again, and that's why they can, for the most part, pull the trigger and detach emotionally from what they want to happen.
Oh, those are fair points. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I will say that I was definitely a lot of what desensitized to my emotions for a lot of situations was just getting in a lot of situations to the point where, okay, well, now I know what to do, and or I can use other situations that are close enough, and that kind of thing. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this is something I want to research a bit more myself, just because if it's kind of the if you can do this for if you can do this for poker, you can possibly do it for a lot of situations where people have emotional hurdles. Um, I mean, that would be a much bigger challenge, but it would be like if you were on tilt, for example, and if you could like sabotage your tilt, that would be really useful. But even beyond that, like if you were like for me, really sleepy, or if you're really, um, like I struggle to get up in the morning. If you could find ways to sabotage that, I found like a couple ways to sabotage that actually. Um, or I mean, people have all kinds of emotional problems. Solving emotional problems is worth a lot more money than solving the logical problems, in my opinion, even in poker. And a lot of things that one thing that's really looked over in poker is that people do have to get over their emotional boundaries, and that is a big barrier towards success that isn't really spoken about. Like what you're talking about, like not running the bluff because of this, and that reason. Really, I think that holds people a lot more people back than actually not than actually like lacking understanding. That's my personal guess. Do you have any insight
Yeah,
on that?
I think Yeah, I think people are always talking about doing your best to stay in the moment, and that's really important. But there's a reason that we all struggle. Something is pulling you out of the moment, usually into the future. You're kind of your predictive software is imagining how am I going to feel if, and that may seem helpful and is probably helpful in other areas of life. I don't think it's just a bug. I think that's probably mostly adaptive and makes us um, better planners than other animals. But when it comes to making the best decision in the moment in a game, I think that it's mostly harmful. I think because the game just doesn't have these same dire consequences that you can have in other areas of life. The worst thing that happens is you lose your chips or your money. And hopefully, being as present as you can in the moment is going to work towards making the best decision for your money, your chips, what have you.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. The more stoic, the better for a poker player. That much we can all agree on. Uh, More robot like. That's why all the Triton guys are robots a lot of the time. No offense. No offense.
No, as far as decision making, I think that there's a lot of truth to that. But that's you mentioned the book at the onset, and that was kind of a big part of the inspiration for wanting to write this book about the high roller tournament players. Is I find like personality wise, they're some of the least robotic people and like really funny, entertaining, enjoyable people to be around that it doesn't translate on TV because when you're streamed, there's a lot of pressure because everyone can see your cards. And much of that time is at a final table where people are making these decisions that are kind of the biggest equity decisions they're going to make for their year and sometimes for their 5 year period. And it's a weird way to kind of judge people's personalities. Like they're not on a reality show. It's not, why am I blanking on the MTV one where everyone lives together, the real world? It's not. It's not a reality show or just meant to be straight entertaining, but realistically, when I started playing some of these high rollers, I was like, what? These guys are nothing like the presentation of them that I think the general public gets. And that was kind of one of the main things I wanted to convey is that I think it's one of the coolest cultures I've ever been around is the high roller tournament pros and players in general.
You kind of read my Yeah. You kind of read my mind. I was about to ask about that. Yeah, I could see that being true for a lot of these guys. It's I don't know all of them that well, to be honest, but I know I've heard like for example, Justin Bonomo is very funny. I did not know that. Okay, that's a surprise to me. I do think, yeah, I mean, a lot of these guys do have a lot of pressure to shut down. I think it's overdone, but whatever. I can understand it. I I'm curious why else you decided to make a write a book about the culture of high stakes poker.
The primary reason, if I'm being honest, is that writing is a passion of mine, and I would one day like to write fiction, but I have made no advances in that direction. Pretty much the only writing I've done since high school is keeping my journal and just random thoughts that I jot down all the time. And I thought this was a good step in that direction. It's not writing nonfiction is not something I'm necessarily passionate about, but that community has become something that I'm passionate about. And I thought it was a good way to get my feet wet in the sense that if I tried to write fiction right now, it would be dog shit. But this is a world that I have really good access to. I think the people in it trust me to write it honestly. And I was very easily able to get a lot of access from many of the best players in the world. Not to mention, I just have immediate access being at those tables and being around the table talk, knowing, not to say the book's going to be about gossip, but the gossip, but knowing how the finances work, who people think are the best players, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a good anchor towards something that is far harder, like writing good fiction or good actual books. Like, seems fucking hard, especially with the book economy being very tough. I'm curious what sort of stories you will be putting in these books. Are you gonna? Do you have a preview? Do you have a couple good stories from the Triton
Yeah.
high stakes
First,
tables?
addressing the money thing. Yeah, I have no ambitions to make money off of this. I think it's a terrible route to go to make money. I think there's a lot of things I could do that would help it sell pretty well that I'm not going to do. And I think the book that would really sell well is about private cash games. I think that a book that is a more accurate and all-encompassing look at what Molly's game looked at has the broad appeal that people want to hear about. I think that high stakes poker players are very aware of what happens in these games, and we know what goes down. And there's plenty of stories that won't be told on a podcast, but they are for these private game runners to write their memoir when they're kind of done using up the Rex that they've been kind of, sucking up to. And there's a lot of good, entertaining material in that world. But I want my book to be a truthful account of what's going on in the high roller tournaments to explain, you know, how the money works, how as far as like backing and what percentage in general different types of people have of themselves. Who do people actually think are the best players? Are there any of the best players who are not represented in these tournaments? Why are they not there? How do people interact with each other? Is it really true that somebody just two out somebody for $1 million and then they go to dinner and they're still friends? Some of this is just pretty obvious and natural to the people in the high stakes world, but I think would be somewhat surprising and interesting to some of the people who don't have an ear to that world.
Okay, which is like a way to test it. I'm a bit curious to see what. Yeah, some of it might be really interesting to an outside audience. I don't know. I get a mixed feedback personally for poker. Some people are really interested. It's usually like very creative types are very interested in this stuff.
I think it's a
I personally
small
guess.
audience. I don't think it reaches beyond people who play a fair amount of poker. Like, I don't see this book appealing to someone who doesn't know what it means to float.
If it, I can tell you that certain demographics have been very interested in poker in my experience. I've gotten mostly positive reception. I got positive reception as this, like at this like world convention and just telling people I was a poker player, where I was intimidated to talk to them because, or I was intimidated to kind of, I was intimidated by them because they're like people who do a lot of research for pharmaceutical drugs and like things like that, like really legit jobs. I'm just sitting here like, play poker. But
Mm-hmm.
they that crowd found it very fascinating, even though they were, had very legit things that they were doing. They worked
Yeah.
for or they
What's
worked
your
for
book
like
about? I
venture.
didn't know you were writing a book.
Oh, so my book was I had this idea to write this book about how poker helped me see a lot of things in the world and helped anchor me towards being a better person in a lot of different ways because it at least in poker, poker has a unique property that it has a pretty fast feedback loop for a lot of different traits. For a lot of different, it has a fast feedback loop for a lot of different actions, and not just actions on the actual poker felt, but also ones like with social behavior and things like that. And it was one way for me to see why certain ways of doing things socially were better than other ways of doing things socially. And so it came as someone who had to deconstruct social interaction because it didn't come so naturally to me. I came to view the way people act socially as like just social strategies that people do. Like, why should I be tied to my character of being like a bad loser or a good loser, or that kind of thing? And why not just pick the one that's optimal? Um, Getting to that, I had this idea. Okay, why not? There's this idea of okay, you play poker and you pick the optimal like way of doing something because it makes you the most money. Well, why not just keep applying this and apply? First of all, like you could a lot of what you do at the table that was like socially pleasant or whatever would end up benefiting your bottom line. So there's that, and then there's this idea. Well, why not just do something that's like optimal for you in terms of your life? And that's kind of what I get at, and I get at like how this like goes towards this idea of making me a better person, and it goes eventually towards this idea of morality. A lot of notes that I was writing in my book, or excuse me, writing in my phone in private, and how they all ended up being connected. So that's uh and I go through a bunch of crazy stories as well while
That's great.
uh
That's really nice when it
while
comes together organically, where the things that you're thinking about and you notice there's actually a theme, and this could be a book that people want to read.
yeah. But yeah, figuring out how to tell a good story is another skill set of sorts that yeah, we'll work on that one. Um, is there are there any plans for your I know you're going to be you're creating a podcast as well that'll be promoting your coaching website, the GTO Lab. Um, any plans with that? Uh,
Yeah, GTO Lab is going to have a few different features, but it's Nick Petrangelo and Dan DeVoris are the quality control guys running the Sims. It's going to
mhm.
be kind of, if you think about Upswing and some of the stuff they have going on, Run It Once and some of the training content, and then GTO Wizard, given that they have Sims and a trainer, little pieces of all of those. We will have a trainer as well, but I am pretty much just in charge of the podcast. I'm not a solver guy. Not to say that I don't look at them and you know try to play and emulate solver poker in many ways against high-end players, but I'm not technically apt, as you figured out when we were trying to get my speakers working going into this podcast. And so my angle is more similar to what I'm doing with the book, where I'm just having high stakes players on to talk, break down a hand, kind of show the human side of them, have some conversations that I would enjoy having with them, similar to what you're doing here, I think. And yeah, my friends are paying me for it, and it's pretty sweet.
And so is it another passion project, or is it strategic to what you're doing to GTO Lab?
It's definitely strategic, but it's yeah, I'm really enjoying it. I like that I don't have to do the elements that I don't want to have anything to do with. I don't have to do any social media associated with it or um, self promotion, which is something that I struggle with. Um, I just don't like it. And so, that being said, I think it's something that I always expected I would enjoy, but would probably never pull the trigger without a company behind me. Um, Probably somewhat out of insecurity that it wouldn't do well. And then also maybe insecurity around um, just, oh yeah, I should have a podcast and I'll just talk and people want to come listen to me. I always felt a little bit weird about that. It started. I don't know if you remember when poker blogs were huge, but especially in the heads up sit and go world, like 40% of heads up sit and go pros had a blog, and I kind of wanted to
Really?
have one. I was like, oh, this is fun, just kind of journaling
What?
and having fans. But it always made me cringe a little bit too, where I was like, oh gosh, I can see myself being embarrassed a week later, and especially a year or 2 years later, looking back. And that's probably okay to be embarrassed of your past self and just live with it. But I'm pretty insecure around that, which is why this is the first podcast I've ever appeared on. I said no every time previously and felt like I couldn't say no to this sort of thing anymore now that I'm asking people to come on mine.
Yeah. Well, I didn't even know it was your first podcast. Congrats for that. All right, sweet. I got it.
Thanks.
Got him, guys. I've got bragging rights. Um, yeah, we're totally showing all the humiliating parts where you stumbled over words and stuff, and editing all my stumbles. I'm a little sad you didn't mention any stories from the Triton tables. All that juicy Triton things, all those
Yeah,
Triton things going on.
it's tough. The best ones, you just like literally the last word on a lot of the best stories is like, this can't ever end up on a podcast. So
Really?
there's, I don't know about a code of silence, but let me think of something that's maybe a little more innocuous. I mean, Steve O'Dwyer told a really good jungle story, but that would be for you to tell.
Which
I
is?
could mention the cliff notes to you, and you decide if you want to tell it on air. But I thought it was really funny.
All right, what are the cliff notes? How bad is it? How bad could
The
it be?
cliff notes was it was a dinner at Ben Lamb's house, and Dan Smith. It was Dan Smith telling the story. He was really stoned, and he brought his girlfriend. You know the story?
Oh, yeah, I know this. I don't know if I want to. Let me think for a second.
Yeah, I figured it's not. I mean, that's kind of how most of these go, where it's like it's really funny, but I don't think it's for like a massive audience.
I did not know Dan was really stoned for that day. That one, that one. I mean, I want to tell it, but I don't want to be an asshole. Basically,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, that's how a lot of them come off, right?
a lot of the stories, there's stories about me that are not accurate, but that
Sure.
one, I don't know how it was told. So I have a story from Triton. Is that one day
Yeah,
I was in the pool room or the KTV room or whatever it is in Maestral, the the one in Montenegro, and
yeah.
Rui Cow comes in and he's drunk, and for some reason he's dying to play pool, and he's like, "Jungleman, you're so bad at pool. Oh my god, I want to play you. I'll lay you 2-1, or 3-1, some stupid price on on pool. I bet I was supposed to bet like 100K HKD, and he bet like no, it must have been I bet something like it must have been a really good price because I bet something like 70K US dollars, and he bet like 300K or 250K, and I won first of all. And then he's
Wow.
like, "Oh my god, I lost to you, Jungle Man. You're so bad. Like, oh my god, I just lost 250, 300K that pool." And then he's like, "All right, we got to play it again. We got to run it again, but we got to do it for more." Stop it! I don't want to do this. And then I think we do it again somehow, and he could have lost 500K US or like 5 million Hong Kong, some insane amount of money on a pool game, and he laid me odds again. And I actually almost won again, so I almost won a 5 million. Well, it was either like 500K or 5 million Hong Kong dollars playing pool versus Roy when he got really drunk one day. So any pool sharks out there, there's your hustling opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, on the flight over, it's not my story to tell, but do you know Brian Rath's story of making a fortune through biking over the course of like a 6 month period?
No, what was this?
Yeah, I think when you have Rast on, it's really good. But he ended up booking three different bicycle bets, um, two of which were on himself, and one of which was on Dan Blazarian, and ended up like plus 1.5 mil over the course of a few months on something that was clearly not on his radar in the way that pool was not on your radar until Rui Cow stumbled in. Yeah, there are some great stories. Sadly, I'm not the guy for them, but because I feel like even the ones that I know, it's just they're not mine to tell. That's kind of how I feel about the book too. So that's
Oh no.
not a wide
You got to get
opinion.
permission for the book. The stories are good for the book and the
Yeah,
podcast.
I agree. I think they're entertaining and people want them, but I'm not ready to give in.
All right. Well, any last words? Any more shout outs to GTO Lab or whatever else you'd like to mention before we go?
Yeah, check out the podcast. Sign up on the waiting list at gtolab.com. I think that there's going to be something for just about everyone who's interested in getting better at poker. We have a good collection of poker minds coming from some different angles, so I'm excited. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and hopefully the guys will put me in charge of the exploit junkyard, and they'll be in charge of the GTO Lab.
All right. Sounds like a plan. Thank you for your time, Jonathan. And guys, check out GTO
Thanks,
Lab.
gentlemen.